Senator Rosen.
Well, thank you, Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Reed, for holding this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Colby, for meeting with me earlier and for your willingness to serve. Before I begin my questions, I want to add my voice to those of my colleagues to express my deep frustration with Friday's shameful Oval Office performance, followed by the President's decision last night to halt the delivery of U.S. military assistance to Ukraine in their fight for their country against a brutal dictator's invasion. I cannot believe that the United States would side with dictators over democracies, over our democratic partners and allies. We must stand with Ukraine. With that, I'm going to move on to a different part of the world, Iran, because we have to combat Iranian aggression. Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. It remains the primary source of instability in the Middle East. It endangers the world through its support of proxies and its pursuit of developing a nuclear weapon. We know Hamas would not have been able to carry out the October 7th terrorist attack in Israel without Iranian support. We know this to be true. Across the region, Iran also continues to work against American interests and poses one of the greatest threats to U.S. military personnel and those of our allies and partners. So, Mr. Colby, like many of my colleagues, I worry that limiting U.S. military involvement in the Middle East, which you've advocated for in the past, could only allow Iran to further grow its influence in the region. And so what are the risks to U.S. national security and the security of the broader region if Iran continues, as you may have advocated in the past, to expand its reach unchecked? If we take our eye off Iran, what happens?
Well, thanks, Senator. Just to be clear, I've always opposed Iran's hegemonic ambitions, and I think to the contrary, my view has been how can we handle this situation, again, if I could stress, from the realistic predicate of where our military is now. And if you look at the 2022 national...
So let me take you at that, because over the last year, Iran has escalated targeting U.S. vessels, personnel in the Gulf of Aden via the Houthis. Iran's proxies, they've targeted U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria via its proxies for many years. So how are we going to address the ongoing threat?
Well, I don't contest that Iran is a threat or a malign regime in the slightest. I fully agree with you about that. I think the intelligent application of our own capabilities in the region, but also using and bolstering the capabilities of our allies, especially our key ally Israel, but also others in the region. We spoke with Senator Ernst about the Abraham Accords model, the ability to bolster some of the Arab states and other European partners that may have an important interest, that this can be a broader thing. And of course, Israel, to its credit, has significantly degraded Hezbollah's capability, of course, Hamas' capability, but also Iran's capability directly. So my view, Senator, just to be very clear, is not that we should ignore the Middle East or that we should totally get out of the Middle East. I'm baselining off the reality that I think all of us, candidly, must baseline off of, which is that we don't have a multi-war military. And you mentioned some of the things that the Iranians have been doing. Well, Admiral Paparo said the other day that the Chinese are now basically in the business of conducting rehearsals, not even exercises. And Frank Kendall, the Secretary of the Air Force, said a couple months ago, at the Biden administration, Secretary of the Air Force, he said not only are the Chinese on track to get ready by 2027, but the PLA will say it's ready by 2027.
Let's talk about China, because I want to learn about China's lessons from Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
China's been identified, of course, as you say, the pacing challenge for the Department of Defense across both the Trump and the Biden administrations. As Ranking Member Reed has quoted former CIA Director Burns, no one is watching U.S. support for Ukraine more closely than Chinese leaders, and that abandoning Ukraine, I'm going to quote again, would be one of the surest ways to rekindle Chinese perceptions of America's fecklessness and stoke Chinese aggressiveness. So, Mr. Colby, after Friday's shameful performance in the Oval Office, what message did President Trump and Vice President Vance send to China regarding American resolve to back democracies against brutal dictators, and how does taking our eye off the ball anywhere make us any less safe?
Well, Senator Rosen, I'd point out that Director Burns, who's a distinguished foreign policy professional, has also said repeatedly that China was continuing to plan to move towards the 2027, and that Xi Jinping did have the intent to ultimately resolve the issue. So, Director Burns is obviously a foreign policy expert of great distinction, but if you look at what he himself has said—
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure, yeah.
Do you think that China China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are working in concert against us to present this multilateral challenge against us so that we
Yes.
won't fight back. So how do you justify taking your eye off,
Senator,
taking our eye off the ball anywhere?
It's arithmetic with respect, Senator.
Right, first of all, your answer to that question was yes, and now you're elaborating on that answer.
Yes, Senator.
Again, I hear much slower than you two talk.
My apologies. Would you like me to continue, Senator?
Yes, if you would elaborate on your affirmative answer to that question.
Yes, Senator, I do believe there's a counter coalition that is working as active. And I know the Chairman, you talked about this extensively. But again, the factual predicate that I think we all must proceed from is that, as the 2022 National Defense Strategy said, we have a one-war military in change. We don't have a military that's capable of fighting four adversaries at the same time. I would like, in theory, in principle, to have such a, but that's not the reality. I believe, especially because the threat is so acute and so realistic, and because of the very real possibility of multi-front war, we must have a realistic plan. And I feel a special obligation that, if confirmed, I must deliver a strategy that actually deals with that. That's not neglecting the Iran threat. That's not neglecting the military threat that Russia poses, but it is a realistic plan to deal with that. And part of that, of course, is greater defense investment and revitalization of our defense industrial base, but it's also making intelligent use of our allies, and in particular, in the case of Europe and countries like Japan and Taiwan, pressing them to take greater responsibility, which they can and must do.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that elaboration, which allowed us, which required us to take a little extra time. And Mr. Colby,